A tradition of neglect. Parliament's power grew post-Glorious Revolution. 50 years after the Glorious Revolution, England was unsure of how strong its ties with the colonies should be. During the period of rule of King George I and II, Parliament gained more control. Parliament became less influenced by the favor of the king and more influenced by the majority vote. Robert Walpole was the first modern prime minister that believed in relaxing trade restrictions in the colonies would bring commerce. At this point, there was no colonial office in London, and all colonial authority rested with the Privy Council. Royal officials in America easily gave in to bribes and allowed colonists to resist the trade restrictions. Salutary neglect. So, Prime Minister Robert Walpole did not strictly enforce what is known as the Navigation Acts. These acts were passed by Britain stating that the colonists could only trade with Great Britain. Colonists were not doing this. They were smuggling, and Walpole looked the other way. Many colonists saw each other as foreigners, and there was a lack of permanent colonial unity. This would change in the coming years. Then there was the Albany Congress. This was called to form a peace treaty with the Iroquois. During this time, the British and the French were having issues with each other, and the British wanted to get the Iroquois on their side, or at least stop them from joining with the French. Also during this time were a bunch of powerful colonial legislatures. In 1750, colonial legislatures claimed the right to levy taxes, make appropriations, approve appointments, and pass laws for the representing colonies. Laws could be vetoed by the Privy Council, but the colonial assemblies had leverage over the Privy Councils because they had control of the colonial budget. The Albany Plan of Union was proposed by Benjamin Franklin and called for an intercolonial government. Ben Franklin was one of the most famous agents who represented Pennsylvania, Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. The Albany Plan was a plan that was proposed by Benjamin Franklin that called for a general government for the colonies. This gave the colonial assembly authority to govern all relations with the Indians and create a president general and a ground council. This plan was approved by the delegates at the conference, but was rejected by the colonial assemblies. The reason the colonies rejected it was because of the federal tax powers. The British also rejected it because they felt that it would give the colonies too much power. This led to Ben Franklin's famous Join or Die political cartoon, where he urged the colonies to unite or face certain death. The struggle for the continent. The colonies were divided. They were all very different. The rise in settlement led to a rise in intercolonial trade. The development of the U.S. Postal Service helped increase communication abilities that helped bring the colonies together. The 7 Years' War. This war was when England was dominated in trade. There was a long battle for power in the New World between English, French, and Iroquois. The war raised to the surface underlying tensions in colonial relationships. Before the French and Indian War, the French and the English were competing for the natives' loyalties. France was more tolerant than England. They married and traded with the natives more and treated them better, but England had more goods to offer the Native Americans. Reasons for conflict. French expansion was a big reason for conflict. King Louis XIV wanted more power. The French Jesuits traveled to find converts, and the French farmers traveled to Mississippi to get land. Some famous explorers had included Cavelier and his de La Salle claim on Louisiana. The French laid a claim on the whole continental interior. This claim for land was both threatening to the colonists and natives. The Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy had a commercial relationship with both the English and the Dutch. They both played the English and the French and used them to gain power. The Ohio Valley was wanted by all of these groups and quickly became potential battleground for its fertile land. France's North American Empire. France now expanded, leaving their forts behind. They found New Orleans based off of plantations, but then New Orleans became a big city. Both the English and the French were aware that the ones with the Indians on their side should win. The Indians wanted to keep their independence. A common practice was marriages of convenience, which was determined by the group with the best terms. At the end of the mid-18th century, the French had a better relationship with the natives because of their tolerance. European conflict. A series of Anglo-French wars continued for 8 years. William's War created a few clashes between the French and English in New England. Queen Anne's War in Europe lasted 12 years and generated substantial conflict. This resulted in border fighting with Spain and the French and Indians becoming allies in the north. King George's War was fought in Europe and was responsible for deteriorating the relationship between the French, English, and Iroquois. The war. This war lasted 9 years with 3 distinct phases. The first 3 wars began in Great Britain and France, and they focused primarily on battles in Europe and only secondarily on conflict in the colonies. The fourth and most decisive war, however, was known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. This was the North American phase of the war, which is often referred to as the French and Indian War. The first phase. First, in 1754, Virginia governor sent a militia led by George Washington into Ohio Valley to challenge the French expansion. Then came the failure of Fort Necessity. This was when Washington built a small stockade and challenged the French. This failure marks the beginning of the war. During this, a third of his men died trapped inside, and they had no chance but to surrender. Then French sent in troops, and the colonists had no help from the British. After this comes Braddock's defeat. Braddock was the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the British Army. He attempted to reclaim the fort at Ohio Valley, but an Indian and French ambush killed Braddock. Virtually all Indian tribes at this point in the war sided with the French except for the Iroquois. This marked the peak of English suffering. Phase 2 of the war was the war abroad. England suffered a constant defeat. Then came William Pitt
was appointed the new Secretary of State and relieved Lord Loudon of his command. Pitt also realized that British Army regular soldiers could not defeat the French and their Indian allies alone. Pitt authorized the raising of local militias in the British colonies and offered the colonials incentives, making them partners with London. The British cause was now reinvigorated.
He took charge of the military in America. So he transferred the American/colonist war efforts to under the British control. A big part of William Pitt's campaign or takeover was impressment. Impressment was the forceful enlisting of colonists to replenish their army. You should note that the colonists resented the British for their impositions. Phase 3 of the war. In this phase, Pitt turned control of the military back to the colonists. Immediately, this resulted in an increase of enlistments. Eventually, the British outnumbered the French and were seizing one stronghold after another. The Siege of Quebec. So this is when British General Geoffrey Amherst and James Wolfe captured fortress at Ohio Valley. Both commanders died in action. However, the fall of Quebec marked the beginning to the end of the American phase of the war.
1859 would see the largest battle of the war with the Battle of Quebec. Even though the battle claimed the lives of the commanders on both sides, seizing Quebec would be a crucial victory for the British, who could now take control of most of North America. The Battle of Quebec would be the last major engagement of the French and Indian War.
1 year later, the French formally surrendered. After this came things like scalp bounties. These were prizes for those who can bring back evidence of killing a native. This was a very violent time, and this was a result of the violent Pitt. Peace came with the ascension of King George III and the resignation of Pitt and his violence. The end of the French and Indian War was settled by the Peace of Paris in 1763. France was essentially moved out of North America, and the French territory was transferred to Great Britain, and they gained a lot of land. The Treaty of Utrecht was the transferred many North American territories to the English. Both colonists and the British fought the French and the Native American allies, and an issue that began to develop between the British and the colonists were that the colonists felt that they were not respected. There were a lack of promotions. A really good example of this is George Washington. He was only promoted so far because his status of being a colonist. Effects of the French and Indian War. This expanded English territorial claim. Also, it left Britain with a massive debt, and they needed to find a way to get money. The answer for this, unfortunately, was to tax the colonists. British leaders developed resentment towards the Americans/colonists because of this. Some consequences is that it brought the colonists together to fight a common enemy. This is the idea of the people army, where colonist soldiers were social and communal. Iroquois passiveness during this war seemed like duplicity to the English, and it resulted in really harsh treatment towards them. Their relationship unraveled, and there was never again military or politically equal relationships with the Iroquois. The map here shows a French territory that was transferred to the English. New imperialism. In 1763, we see the end of salutary neglect. Britain begins to tax the colonists, which really upsets them. There was a huge spike of defiance in trade after the war. Commercial versus territorial imperialists. Commercial imperialists wanted to take Guadeloupe of Canada because of the sugar it produces. Imperialists, on the other hand, wanted to keep Canada because it had a rapid population increase. Colonists debated what should be done / who will rule the Western land. Britain's staggering war debt. It became clear that Britain could not control the colonies anymore. Britain believed only a system of taxation would help them cooperate with paying off debt. Well, they were very wrong. George Grenville. He was a prime minister that felt that the colonists should pay their fair share. The war was fought and the colonists benefited, so why didn't they have to pay? Next, in 1763, came Pontiac's Rebellion. This was a rebellion for a conflict with Native Americans led by Pontiac himself. This took place in present-day Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, what was then known as the Northwest Territory. The British had an idea of what they would do to avoid another one of these by letting the colonists expand into their area. This directly led to the Proclamation Line of 1763. This line forbade colonial expansion beyond the Appalachians. After this came the taxes. The Sugar Act of 1764. That was one of the first taxes that Britain instituted after salutary neglect. It was a tax on sugar to reduce illegal trade and smuggling. This lowered the cost of an older version of the tax and established vice admiralty courts, which were courts that were set up for smugglers and to try smugglers. These weren't fair. They were given no trial by jury, and people would be guilty until proven innocent. The next act is the Currency Act of 1764, and yes, it was in the same year. This act said that colonists could no longer use paper money. This was hard for a lot of the colonists because there was not a large supply of gold and silver, and many of them did not have any. Lastly, there was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a tax on 50 paper documents, including newspapers, playing cards, marriage licenses, and other legal documents. Virtually every colonist bought something that would be affected by the Stamp Act. Colonists were upset that the tax was passed without the consent of the colonial assemblies. You need to know that. There was a theme that the colonists are not against taxes themselves, but they're against that the taxes were not passed by their own representatives and colonial assemblies. They were upset that they were passed without their consent, and this led to the Stamp Act Congress. Stirrings of revolt. First off was the Stamp Act Congress. This was a direct result of the Stamp Act and was the first attempt at colonial unity against the British. Another form of revolt was Patrick Henry and the Virginia Resolves. They had a belief that Americans should have the same rights as the English and that Virginians should only pay taxes that were passed by the Virginia Assembly. Another form of revolt was James Otis. He called for an intercolonial Congress to take action against the Stamp Act. A group that would revolt during this time was called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty terrorized Stamp Act tax collectors. They would often tar these collectors with feathers on top of the tar and anyone who even bought British goods. So there was a lot of boycotting going on in this time. The Declaratory Act was passed after the repeal of the Stamp Act. So this stated that the future Parliament could pass any laws whatsoever. So in full, Britain decided that this Stamp Act wasn't effective, but they kind of wanted to save face and say that they could pass any laws in the future. Then there was Charles Townshend. He was essentially the British Secretary of Treasury and comes up with new ideas to raise revenue. The Quartering Act of 1765. This act stated that colonists must provide quarters and supplies for British troops. This essentially meant that troops could knock on the door of any colonist and expect a bed and food and would not be compensated for it. This upset the colonists so much that when they eventually wrote the Bill of Rights in the future, this was in the Third Amendment. The New York Assembly was disbanded because many people refused to comply with this Quartering Act. Townshend duties. So this was a new tax on imports such as lead, paper, paint, and most importantly, tea. This will come up later. Non-importation agreements. These were why Stamp Act Congress was so successful. This was essentially a boycott for all British goods. This led to the growth of an American homespun movement. The American homespun movement basically said that Americans should begin to make their own clothing. This resulted in industries beginning to boom in America. All Townshend duties were repealed except for the tea. The Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. There was a conflict between colonists and redcoats in Boston. Although they don't know why, 5 British fired and ended up killing 5 colonists. This resulted in Paul Revere's famous engraving. Within 7 days, this engraving was seen throughout the colonies. Peaceful protesting colonists were portrayed with pools of blood on the ground. This is a really good example of early on propaganda, and it does not show the hostile crowd throwing snowballs with rocks in them. Samuel Adams, who was John Adams' second cousin, was a lead revolutionary. He proposed committees of correspondence in 1772, which is another example of colonial unity. Colonists would come together to share stories and grievances and ways to boost the colonial spirit. The tax issue. So at this point, Americans believed that they should no longer be taxed without their consent. This came the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." English countered this with saying that they would actually have a virtual representation. They told the colonists that they might not have someone that is representing them elected into Parliament, but because they are under the British control, the laws they pass will benefit all people. Therefore, the colonists are virtually represented in Parliament. The colonists did not like the idea of virtual representation. Then there was the tea. The British East India Tea Company was on the verge of bankruptcy, so Britain gave them a monopoly advantage by making the tea trade with the Tea Act of 1773. This lowered the cost of tea. You should note that it actually lowered the cost, but was designed to bail out the British East India Company. Even though this tea was cheaper than smuggled tea, the colonists still hated it because they were against all British taxes.
December 16, 1773, a band of American colonists approached 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. The men are disguised as Indians, and they have a mission: destroy the tea on board each ship to protest yet another British tax on the colonies. The Boston Tea Party, as it comes to be known, is rooted in growing friction between the colonies and the British Crown over Parliament's right to levy taxes. For the past 13 years, Britain has taxed a number of items used in the colonies, everything from sugar to playing cards, each time the colonists protested. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This required the colonists to purchase only British tea. Though it was actually cheaper than other teas, it was taxed, and to many colonists, that was intolerable. In Boston, the colonists demanded the tea ships return to Britain. The British refused. So, the colonists took matters into their own hands.
The interesting thing about the Tea Party is we think that there's like a wild sort of riot or mob and that there's mass confusion, and actually the colonists were really specifically interested in making a point about tea to the British. So they didn't storm and destroy the ship. They actually didn't damage this ship at all. They just went for the tea. They didn't even break the lock to the hatch. They just wanted to make a point that the tax was bad, and they were going to show that by just destroying the tea.
The British were outraged. They closed Boston Harbor to trade and tried to assert even more control over Massachusetts. The colonists resisted, united in a growing defiance against England. 16 months after the Boston Tea Party in 1775, the American Revolution begins.
The Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. Here, Americans boarded ships and dumped all the tea into the Boston Harbor. Britain is furious with this, and in response passed the Intolerable, or otherwise known as Coercive Acts. The Intolerable Acts. These were, as again, a direct result of the Boston Tea Party. This basically closed up the port of Boston until the damages were paid. This sets up extraterritoriality for British officers accused of crimes. Extraterritoriality is when you are shipped back to Britain for a trial, which was usually unfair because if a British soldier committed a crime, they were usually not given the correct consequences in Britain. There were also not allowed colonial witnesses taken back to Britain with them. Americans were very upset by this. This basically reduced colonial government power. Then came the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act extended the boundaries of Quebec from Canada down to the Ohio Valley. This concerned Americans or colonists because they thought it was an encroachment on their land they fought so hard for in the war. This also upset many people in Quebec because Roman Catholics were now living very close to them, and there was some religious tension. Cooperation in war. The Intolerable Acts were hated by the colonists and led to the First Continental Congress. All 13 of the colonies except for Georgia met in Philadelphia and created a list of grievances. They wanted to repeal most acts in 1763 and essentially go back to salutary neglect. They called for military preparations against the British in case there was going to be more conflict, and called for a strict non-importation and non-consumption of all trade with Britain, so they continued to boycott the British goods. They promised they would meet again in a year, which would become the Second Continental Congress. Important to note that they did not want independence at this time. Most Americans up to 1776 just wanted to go back to the policy of salutary neglect. The Battle of Lexington. Lexington was a battle near Boston where British sought to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Minutemen, a famous one, William Dawes and Paul Revere, warned of the British coming. They would give quick speeches to everyone. In this battle, 8 Minutemen were killed. Concord. This was when the British moved to Concord to find a mission. Americans removed most of it, but the British burned some. The Americans fought the British all the way back to Boston using guerrilla warfare, which was showed what type of fighting would be used during the American Revolution.